We are going to turn now to another major story that we are following very closely here, and that is the fact that former FBI Director James Comey going to be appearing in court later on today, his first court appearance since being indicted. The two-count indictment alleging that Comey made a false statement to the Senate Judiciary Committee on September 30th of 2020 by denying he had authorized an associate to serve as an anonymous source to the news media and that he obstructed a congressional proceeding. Comey has denied all wrongdoing. A couple of live looks that we do have coming out on this Wednesday. This first one here, taking a look just outside of the courthouse there in Alexandria, Virginia, where Comey is expected to make that court appearance.
Former FBI Director James Comey has now appeared in federal court in Virginia over charges connected to an alleged threat against the president, and the case is already fueling a much larger debate over the Justice Department, the FBI, and whether federal law enforcement is being used for legitimate accountability or political retaliation. Prosecutors argue the case stems from an older Instagram post they claim crossed the line into threatening territory toward Donald Trump, while Comey denies wrongdoing, and his legal team is preparing to argue that the prosecution is vindictive, meaning the case was brought not because of neutral legal judgment, but because Comey has spent years as one of Trump's most visible critics. That is exactly why this moment carries so much weight. This is no longer only about one social media post, one indictment, or one courtroom appearance. It is about a sitting president's Justice Department pursuing a former FBI director who once investigated him, while Trump openly celebrates the indictment and calls for further scrutiny of officials who challenged him. The next detail explains why many believe this extends far beyond an ordinary criminal threat case. Now let's look at the moment the Justice Department announces the two-count indictment against Comey.
The Justice Department has secured a second indictment against former FBI Director James Comey after the effort to charge him last year fell flat. Now, in the indictment, the Trump administration is accusing Comey, a frequent critic of President Trump, of knowingly and willfully making a threat against the president. Now, the case all stems from this. It's a since-deleted social media post showing seashells in the sand arranged to form the numbers 86 and 47. 86 can refer to getting rid of something, and Trump is the 47th president.
On April 27, 2026, the Justice Department announced that a federal grand jury had returned a two-count indictment against James Comey. According to reports, the charges involve threatening the president and transmitting threats across interstate commerce. Prosecutors say the basis is an Instagram post and related conduct they argue moved beyond protected speech into criminal threat territory. Federal threat laws exist for a reason. Public officials should not face credible threats of violence, but applying those laws against a former FBI director over a social media post represents a major prosecutorial decision, especially when the alleged target is the same president who has wanted Comey held accountable for years. That is where this case becomes less about Comey as an individual and more about whether the Justice Department is acting impartially. That is the central issue. The next clip helps explain why James Comey remains one of the most controversial figures in American politics.
Of course, in addition to our technical work, we interviewed many people, from those involved in setting up the personal email system and maintaining the various iterations of Secretary Clinton's server, to staff members with whom she corresponded on email, to those involved in the email production to state, and finally Secretary Clinton herself. Although we did not find clear evidence that Secretary Clinton or her colleagues intended to violate laws governing the handling of classified information, there is evidence that they were extremely careless in their handling of very sensitive, highly classified information.
James Comey has never been a universally accepted or uncomplicated figure. He remains deeply controversial. Both Democrats and Republicans have criticized major decisions he made throughout his career. His handling of the Clinton email investigation angered one side. His involvement in the Russia investigation infuriated Trump and his supporters. His memos documenting conversations with Trump became part of one of the defining political conflicts of Trump's first term. So this is not about claiming Comey should never face scrutiny. The larger question is whether this indictment would exist inside a politically neutral Justice Department, or whether it exists because Comey is viewed as an enemy of Trump. The broader pattern involving former FBI officials makes those concerns more difficult to dismiss. Here is where the story expands, because the Comey indictment appears alongside wider pressure on former FBI officials.
Approximately a dozen FBI employees who worked on President Trump's classified documents investigation have been fired, according to multiple sources. The firings followed a report from Reuters that said the Bureau subpoenaed records of phone calls made by FBI Director Kash Patel and White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles when they were still both private citizens as part of the special counsel's probe. Director Patel did not provide any evidence of wrongdoing by those who were terminated.
That concern becomes even stronger when you step back and look at the broader pattern. The indictment against Comey is not unfolding in isolation. It arrives alongside reports of personnel actions involving FBI staff connected to earlier Trump investigations. It also comes amid reporting about probes involving other former FBI figures, including Christopher Wray, who was originally appointed by Trump himself. That matters because the pattern appears to stretch beyond one individual. It begins to resemble something larger, a wider campaign directed at people involved in investigations Trump opposed. Trump's own public reaction is what makes the distinction between accountability and retaliation appear increasingly thin. Now let's examine the report showing Trump publicly celebrating the Comey indictment while encouraging further investigations. Trump has not hidden his position. According to reports, he publicly celebrated the indictment against Comey, encouraged additional investigations into former officials, and made clear he believes using DOJ and FBI resources against people who investigated him is justified. That is what makes this situation so concerning. When a president openly praises the indictment of a former FBI director who once investigated him, then pushes for further scrutiny of others connected to that same institutional network, the boundary between law enforcement and political retaliation begins to narrow. The larger institutional issue is whether the independence of the DOJ and FBI can withstand this level of pressure. This next part explains why DOJ and FBI independence has become the center of the controversy. The independence of the Justice Department and the FBI is not simply a symbolic principle. It is part of the framework that allows the public to believe investigations are guided by evidence and law, rather than personal revenge. That independence has never been perfect, and American history contains real examples of political abuse within law enforcement institutions. But what makes this moment feel different is how openly political it appears. The targeting is not subtle. The celebration is public. The pressure is direct. The individuals being pursued are tied to investigations involving the sitting president. That creates a precedent capable of lasting beyond one administration and potentially weakening confidence in federal law enforcement for years. Inside the FBI, the chilling effect may prove even more damaging than the public controversy itself. Now watch how fear within the FBI could slowly weaken the institution from the inside. The FBI depends on career agents, analysts, and officials who are expected to follow evidence wherever it leads. But what happens when those people watch former leaders indicted, colleagues removed, and careers damaged because they participated in investigations that were lawful at the time, but later became politically inconvenient? They absorb a message. Some decide to resign. Some retire earlier than planned. Some avoid politically sensitive assignments. Others become less aggressive. Some begin thinking less about where evidence points, and more about whether a future president might punish them for doing their jobs. That is how institutions weaken without one dramatic collapse. That is how long-term damage develops, not always through a single explosive event, but through fear. If agents begin believing that lawful investigative work today could make them political targets tomorrow, the quality and independence of federal law enforcement slowly erode. The most experienced personnel may leave first because they have opportunities elsewhere. Those who remain may become increasingly cautious. Over time, an agency built to investigate without fear becomes one shaped by political survival. The legal argument behind this indictment may now become one of the most important issues in the entire case. This is where the legal battle turns critical, as courts examine the difference between true threats and protected political speech. Threat laws require careful interpretation because courts have to distinguish between true criminal threats and speech that may be offensive, sarcastic, politically charged, or simply poor judgment protected under the Constitution. Prosecutors must determine whether words actually rise to the level of criminal conduct. Even in a politically neutral environment, that judgment can be difficult. In this environment, where the alleged victim is the president and the defendant is a former FBI director who once investigated him, the decision becomes far more controversial. That does not automatically mean the case lacks legitimacy, but it does mean courts are likely to examine it closely. The final risk is that a weak or politically motivated prosecution could damage DOJ credibility far beyond Comey himself. Legal analysts from different ideological perspectives have reportedly raised questions about whether this is the kind of case prosecutors would normally pursue. That skepticism matters. If the case appears legally weak, and if courts eventually determine prosecutors overreached, the consequences will not end with one failed indictment. It would affect the credibility of the Justice Department itself. A prosecution perceived as politically motivated and later rejected in court becomes evidence, for many Americans, that the justice system is being weaponized. The Christopher Wray angle makes the broader pattern even harder to ignore. Now look at how the Christopher Wray connection makes the situation even more alarming. Christopher Wray was not appointed by Democrats. Trump selected him after firing Comey. If even Trump's own former FBI director can later become a target because the bureau under his leadership pursued matters Trump disliked, then future FBI directors may receive a very clear message. Loyalty to the law may not protect you from political consequences. That becomes dangerous because the FBI director's role is supposed to require independence from the president's personal interests. If every director begins worrying about future punishment, then the position itself risks becoming politically compromised. This is where the precedent becomes especially concerning. If one administration uses federal law enforcement to pursue officials connected to earlier investigations, future administrations may adopt the same approach. Once that door opens, every FBI director, prosecutor, or senior law enforcement official may begin wondering whether a future president will investigate them for decisions made in good faith. That moves the country closer to a system where law enforcement becomes a political instrument rather than an independent institution. The political implications are equally clear. Democrats and progressive groups will likely point to this indictment as evidence that Trump is weaponizing the Justice Department. Their argument will be straightforward. The president is using federal authority to target people who investigated him. That message could resonate beyond partisan audiences, especially among voters who may not personally support Comey, but still believe the justice system should not be used for revenge. In competitive midterm races, perceptions like that could matter. The question now is, which interpretation ultimately prevails? One version argues the DOJ is simply holding a powerful former official accountable for conduct that crossed a legal line. The other argues the DOJ is being used to punish a political opponent, with the indictment functioning as part of a broader campaign against former FBI leaders and investigators. Courts will decide the legal issues, but the institutional consequences are already unfolding. Public trust is being tested now. FBI morale is being affected now. Confidence in institutions is being strained now. Finally, this next section explains what viewers should watch as the Comey case moves forward. Going forward, the signs to monitor are becoming clearer. Watch how judges respond to early motions in Comey's case, especially if the defense argues vindictive prosecution or challenges whether the Instagram post legally qualifies as a true threat. Watch whether more former FBI officials, including Christopher Wray or others, become formal targets of investigations or indictments. Watch whether Republican lawmakers begin expressing concern about DOJ authority being used against former law enforcement officials. And watch whether current or former FBI personnel start speaking more openly about morale, fear, resignations, and the chilling effect on investigations. The bottom line is straightforward. The Justice Department has indicted a former FBI director over an Instagram post. The president publicly celebrated the indictment. Other former FBI leaders and staff connected to Trump-related investigations are reportedly facing probes, firings, subpoenas, or pressure. And legal analysts are questioning whether this reflects ordinary prosecution or political direction. Each piece matters on its own, but together they form a much larger picture. A presidency testing whether federal law enforcement remains an independent check on power or can evolve into an instrument of personal retaliation. This is not a side issue. It is a major test of the rule of law. If the Justice Department can be used to punish individuals who once investigated the president, future officials may learn from that precedent. If courts push back, if Congress demands answers, and if the public refuses to normalize revenge-driven prosecutions, institutional safeguards may still hold. But right now, the Comey indictment has become much more than a legal dispute. It has become a warning sign about the future of American democracy and the independence of federal law enforcement.